During planning for the invasion of Iraq, I was often asked by American colleagues, what were the lessons from Northern Ireland? Later, as the situation in Basra began to unravel, the question mutated into why had we done so well in Belfast, but so badly in Basra? I was actually embarrassed by these questions because, unlike the US Army, we at that time had no formal mechanism for capturing lessons, and there had been no military analysis of what happened in Northern Ireland and why. And yet there are useful lessons to be learned from the Northern Ireland campaign. And these lessons become even more useful when compared to what happened or didn't happen in Iraq. Why was it that we had done so well in Belfast, but so badly in Basra? Although success in one and failure in the other were deeply rooted and not solely attributable to our relative ability to adapt in combat, it is highly instructive to compare the learning systems across the two campaigns. Now, the British Army in Northern Ireland in the late 1980s and early 1990s was, I contend, probably one of the best armies that Britain had ever fielded. It could take its place alongside Wellington's Peninsular Army of 1814 or Slim's 14th Army of 1945. George MacDonald Fraser, in his memoir of his time as an NCO in the Border Regiment in Burma, Quartered Safe Out Here, said that the 14th Army weren't professionals, which at the time when he wrote it was one of the Army's recruiting slogans in the 1980s. So they weren't professionals, they were experts. And they were experts at fighting the Japanese. And Daniel Marston this morning talked a little bit about how they became experts. Well, by the late 1980s, the British Army in Northern Ireland was again expert. And there were many reasons behind this expertise, but a cursory analysis would include an effective framework operation that fused deterrence, population control, and information gathering, a powerful focus on intelligence, including databases, widespread surveillance network, human and interagency cooperation, continuity built into the military structure with a mix of 6-month and 2.5-year battalion tours, with permanent resident brigade and force headquarters, and strong encouragement for what we call continuity NCOs, CONCOs, to remain deployed in theatre almost indefinitely. The use of indigenous forces, in Northern Ireland's case, the Ulster Defence Regiment, the UDR, and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, both needed to be built almost entirely from scratch, but were then completely integrated into the operation, resulting in enhanced security force numbers, of course, continuity and understanding, and in the case of the police, primacy for the campaign from 1976. And lastly, and perhaps most effectively, an agile connection between units in theatre, the training organisation, and specific to theatre doctrine development that result in a very high degree of tactical adaptation. Now, these were all weaknesses in Iraq and indeed initially in Afghanistan. There was no intelligence database, no effective security framework, very limited integration of indigenous forces, no continuity, and no close linkage between theatre, training, and doctrine adaptation. At face value, something here had gone terribly wrong. What seemed to have been, or should have been, institutional lessons from Northern Ireland were not applied in Iraq and Afghanistan, or if they were, only after a great expenditure of time, money, and blood. But expertise, like wine, doesn't travel well. The 14th Army was expert at fighting the Japanese, not the Germans. They would probably have done less well at Monte Cassino, perhaps. Similarly, our 1980s and 90s Army, after 20 years of trial and error, was expert at countering Irish Republican terrorism and insurgency in Northern Ireland. By itself, this doesn't mean they'll be expert at anything else. First lesson identified by the UK's Stabilisations Unit report responding to stabilisation challenges and hostile and insecure environments is that all conflicts are different. However, the process of becoming expert can be applied elsewhere. And this paper explores the nature of the Army's expertise in Northern Ireland, and why we didn't seem to be able to carry this legacy into the slums of Basra. It does this first by examining the process of British Army adaptation in Northern Ireland. Now, for much of the campaign in Northern Ireland, there was no formal articulation of tactical doctrine. Until 1989, bearing in mind the campaign started in 69, 20 years earlier, there was no single book or pamphlet akin to the Jungle Book mentioned by Daniel this morning, and I'll show you the cover of it, which is a result of the culture of the time. So for the 14th Army in Burma, you can see the sorts of pictures that they included, or anti-terrorist operations, or ATOM, in Malaya. Until 1989, the system for capturing and disseminating doctrine in Northern Ireland can best be described as chaotic. Yet it was a chaos that worked, and it worked well. At the centre of this chaos was the Northern Ireland Training and Advisory Team, or NITAT, the principal training organisation for Northern Ireland, with two arms, one in Britain and one in Germany, for those units deploying for the British Army of the Rhine. The two NITATs were ostensibly under the commands of their relative headquarters in Britain and Germany, but in reality they operated under and responded to direction from headquarters Northern Ireland. Now, officers and senior NCOs from NITAT were frequent visitors to the deployed battalions. These NITAT officers and senior NCOs were top quality tactical operators, specifically selected as instructors and recently returned from demanding operational tours in the province. On their visits back to the province, they collected feedback from battalions' earlier training packages, picked up any local developments in PIRA, provisional IRA, tactics or technology, and compared best practice across the province. And it was NITAT instructors, not staff officers in headquarters Northern Ireland, who produced and updated what the Army called aid memoirs, covering all tactical aspects of the operation: urban, rural patrolling, observation posts, reaction to IEDs, reaction to shoots, base protection, preventing mortar attacks, etc., etc. And these procedural aid memoirs weren't pamphlets, they were loose-leafed, Ronioed, or later photocopied, A4 sheets. And these were issued to battalions going through training, or later during tours as drills were updated. Their advantage, they're easy to keep up to date. New aid memoirs were inserted into officers' folders, the plastic folders that we all had, and old ones discarded. Costs were minimal, no bound books or expensive print runs, almost a perfect system for easy and rapid adaptation in the pre-digital age. Now, the role of the brigade staffs and at headquarters Northern Ireland was to facilitate the process, not to run it. When I was in the staff, we produced serious incident reports about every incident that examined terrorist methods and lessons that may be learned. The weapons intelligence section, with the WIS, played a vitally important role in this. Brigade staffs also ensured the latest aid memoirs were distributed across the units. But primarily, tactical adaptation was a process between battalions and trainers, working with a doctrine process that was at heart informal. It wasn't until 1989 that Northern Ireland tactical doctrine was first formalised through the creation of Northern Ireland Standard Operating Procedures, or NISOPs, and with it the creation of a doctrine branch in headquarters Northern Ireland that became the authority on tactical drills. Now, this development appealed to those discomforted by the chaos of constantly evolving battle drills. We created order on a system that up to then had depended on personal relationships, informal liaison, mutual trust, and professional respect. Counterintuitively, formalising authority over doctrine within the province, as opposed to NITAT in Folkestone, created greater separation between operational battalions and the doctrine authority. It was now the responsibility of a staff officer in a large static headquarters who didn't have the detailed understanding of how operations were conducted across the many different areas of operations, nor how were they constantly evolving, nor the difficulties faced at lower levels. And this was not the case with the NITAT captains and colour sergeants who, when they weren't conducting training, spent their time on operations with the deployed battalions. So doctrine development became a staff function, not one solely involving operational battalions and their trainers. An additional staff layer had been created that by definition reduced adaptability. And once doctrine is in a printed publication, it immediately becomes more difficult to amend. And although NISOPs was a loose-leaf pocketbook, so individual places could be easily replaced, there was an understandable reluctance to amend it more than 3 or 4 times a year. Fortunately, by the early 1990s, the tactical situation in the province had stabilised as the campaign came to a close, to such an extent that exceptional tactical adaptability was no longer as necessary as it had been. So formalisation of the process didn't have a significant impact on the campaign. And furthermore, as the campaign ebbed to a close, actually the earlier system of informal adaptation would naturally have dried up. And so publishing NISOPs when we did actually did have the effect of capturing our Northern Ireland doctrine at its most developed. Otherwise, it would have been lost. Now, this is not a general argument against formalisation and articulation of doctrine. There's a difference between high-level doctrine, the philosophy and principles that are enduring and generally applicable, and we've heard something about that, and lower-level doctrine, the practices and tactics, and procedures that change over time and by theatre. And indeed, within theatre, in Northern Ireland, we had different tactics for rural and urban operations, despite sharing common principles. And higher level doctrine, as we've heard, is all about education, educating people how to think, how to approach problems, and creating a common understanding about that approach. And lower level doctrine is all about training people to conduct low-level tactics on the ground. So in the British Army, we need the higher level doctrine that is in currently the Army Doctrine publication, Land Operations, or the Army Field Manual, Counterinsurgency. And to answer an earlier question, these are actually aimed at the people going through education. So yes, of course, they are largely word-based. But these should not be confused with the need for in-theatre tactics and drills that change constantly depending on the enemy and the nature of environment. And those need to be understood, read and understood by much lower levels. Now, admittedly, the chaotic system of adaptability in Northern Ireland works so well largely because with the army there in Northern Ireland was relatively small. From the mid-1970s, there were 10 regular infantry battalions and 10 battalions of the locally recruited Ulster Defence Regiment. So trainers visiting battalions regularly were able to establish personal and trusted relationships with every battalion. And also, Ulster is a small place. You can drive around the province in a couple of days, fairly leisurely. So it's relatively easy to visit battalions and discuss tactical updates. Such a system would have been impossible in Malaya because of the size of the country, or in Burma because of the size of the 14th Army. But arguably it should have been perfectly possible in Basra or Helmand. During the period of maximum adaptation in Northern Ireland, during the 1970s and 1980s, therefore, there was no authoritative and formal tactical doctrine publications. Tactical doctrine was ephemeral, fleeting and for the moment. Probably no copies of those Ronioed procedural aid memoirs exist today, let alone enough to create an audit trail to demonstrate adaptation in practice. And yet, this informal, chaotic system of adaptation worked precisely because it was not formalized. So here's the paradox. There's no written analysis of adaptation in Northern Ireland, no PhD theses, simply because by its very nature, it defied categorization and formalization. When we did formalize it, starting in 1989, it became less adaptable. So this is the first principal reason why a critical lesson from Northern Ireland was lost. The chaotic and highly successful system of adaptation was never captured, never written down, maybe even never really understood. Unless you happened to live it in the 1970s and 80s, as I did, you would have never known that it existed. So what was the equivalent system in Iraq? During the 1990s, as the Northern Ireland campaign drew to a close and the Balkans became the main effort, there was a natural effort to exploit the extraordinary facility that NITAT had become. It had at that time some of the best tactical ranges in Europe and excelled at low-level infantry training in urban environments. So the Northern Ireland Training Advisory Team, NITAT, evolved to become the Operations Training Advisory Group, or OPTAG. It no longer specialized in Northern Ireland, but was a generic pre-deployment training organization for all operations. But generic is not good enough. OPTAG never had sufficient expertise in any specific theatre to really support that theatre in the way that NITAT had done. It takes a lot more than teaching people to shoot straight and to understand the laws of armed conflict to prepare them for the complex campaigns we have conducted in this century, or indeed to paint a mural of Saddam Hussein on a mock-up of an Irish village, as you might be able to see in that bottom photograph. Preparing units for Iraq and Afghanistan simultaneously was a serious challenge in which OPTAG failed. It tried to run generic training packages focused on individual skills, but of course it satisfied no one. As one wag on arse, the British Army's unofficial blog, put it, OPTAG taught me everything I needed to know about deployment operations in Iraq. Unfortunately, I was going to Afghanistan. But apparently that didn't matter very much. Actually, when I last went through OPTAG in late 2007, before deploying to Iraq, I felt it taught me everything I needed to know about deploying on operations to Afghanistan. So actually, nobody was really satisfied. And of course, the two theatres were completely different. You know, just for example, small example, in Basra, our bases were being rocketed daily. In Helmand, there were no rockets, but lots of victim-operated IEDs, which we didn't have in Basra. But the training led us to believe there was no distinction. Now, we've seen the pivotal role that NITAT had in doctrine development and adaptability in the Northern Ireland campaign. Successful because of mutual professional respect between battalions and the NITAT instructors. And because these instructors were respected, they were always welcomed and given complete access by battalions in the province. So NITAT was always up to date and best placed to circulate updates to our tactical drills as the threat evolved or new kit appeared. Now, for much of the Iraq and Afghan campaigns, not at the end of the Afghan campaign, but for much of it, there was no such respect for the blokes in OPTAG. They were regarded as out of touch, and what they taught was generally not relevant. Any views they may have had on tactical drills were not disseminated, and few made it to theatre, certainly in the first decade of the 21st century, to keep themselves up to date. Fortunately, as the British withdrew from Iraq and concentrated properly on Afghanistan from 2010, the situation changed and OPTAG became solely focused on preparing units and individuals for Afghanistan. The Afghan counterinsurgency centre was opened at Warminster. Our instructors were sent for update visits into theatre, and training facilities dramatically improved. But there was no attempt to forge the trainers, battalions, and tactical doctrine authority into a single adaptive system as there had been in Northern Ireland. But that's not surprising, given that a flexible system of adaptation in Northern Ireland was never really understood, so could never really be emulated in later campaigns. And I want to turn to one of the most significant causes for our lack of operational success in Iraq, and what severely limited our ability to adapt. And this is the 6-month tour. In Northern Ireland, only the frontline battalions in the very hardest operational areas were on short tours. All the headquarters were static, with individual commanders and staffs rotating on a 2-yearly basis. A number of battalions were on residential 2.5-year tours. I've done a couple of those. In Iraq, few British officers served for more than 6 months. David Petraeus asked his British staff in his headquarters to serve for longer, but I think I was the only British officer to have served for a year in Basra. We sent formed divisional and brigade headquarters to Basra for 6-month tours, rather than adopting the Northern Ireland model of static headquarters with individually posted commanders and staff officers. The formed headquarters had the advantage, so we said, of deploying coherent bodies of people who knew each other, knew the units, and could stand the stress of combat. But had the disadvantages that the headquarters never built expertise, there was a complete loss of continuity every 6 months, and it encouraged a short-term outlook. Now, each of these in itself jeopardizes operational success. Taken together, they are probably responsible, more than any other factor, I think, for our relative lack of success on operations in Iraq and initially in Afghanistan. So let's just look at some examples. First, short tours limit the build-up of tactical expertise. Our tactical drills should be, in theatre, based on an understanding of the enemy's capabilities and how he uses them, so we can counter them with our own tactics. This is as equally applicable to a section commander as a brigade commander. Understanding enemy's tactics, of course, takes work. So we need to study how they operate and the weapons they use, and develop applicable counters to those tactics and weapons, and then promulgate that knowledge widely until it becomes corporate understanding. In Iraq, we failed to implement such learning systems because units were simply not there for long enough. And neither OPTAG nor anyone else was responsible for institutionalizing learning in the way that NITAT had done in Northern Ireland. I'll illustrate this with a small vignette. In Basra, we knew that Jaish al-Mahdi, the Shia militia, used 30 or 60-minute timing devices built in Iran to initiate rocket attacks on our base at the airport. Because we'd found such devices, and the Weapons Intelligence Section, WIS, had produced reports on them. Unfortunately, this understanding had not been grasped by M&D Southeast operations staff. So on a rocket attack on the 8th of May 2008, ISTAR identified a number of men at a rocket firing point, perhaps 3 minutes after an attack had been launched. This is not the firing point, but it's a very similar setup to this one here, with roughly the same number of rockets. Now, the operations staff assumed that the people by the rockets, not these people, in fact, are Americans, they assumed that people by the rockets were the Jaish al-Mahdi firing party. So they fired 2 Hellfire missiles and a number of 155mm rounds at them. The men, of course, were subsequently found to be Iraqi army soldiers examining the rocket firing. The driver of this up-armored Humvee, and that's what a Humvee looked like when it's been hit by Hellfire, of course, was killed. Several others were injured. Now, this blue-on-blue would never have occurred if the operation staff had understood what we already knew to be militia doctrine. They initiated rockets using timers and didn't wait around to watch them fire. In Iraq, our understanding of how our enemies thought and worked was minimal, in southern Iraq at least, was minimal compared to our understanding of the provisional IRA. As a result, commanders were often unwilling to consider risk, which you cannot assess without understanding, and hence overemphasize force protection when quite unnecessary, paradoxically, of course, increasing the risk to British soldiers. 6-month tour also imposed a lack of continuity, with significant changes of strategy and approach with each change of divisional command, often based on little more reason than trying to make an impact during a short tour, and possibly winning a medal in the result. So even the kind of war we were fighting was recharacterized every 6 months. One divisional commander believed we were dealing with insurgency. His successor refuted that and claimed it was criminality, famously, and in my view, wrongly, likening Basra to Palermo, not Beirut. Another, after Operation Charge of the Knights had re-established Iraqi government control of southern Iraq in 2008, decided, equally wrongly I think, that the insurgency had been defeated by a single battle, and that we no longer had to help the Iraqi army to build a long-term counterinsurgency infrastructure. Instead, the emphasis changed to short-term enhancement of the Iraqi security forces, sufficient to enable our own withdrawal. These wild changes in strategy bewildered the Iraqis we were supporting, and of course, it's totally contrary to being able to bring qualitative improvement in performance through tactical adaptation. If we didn't even know what kind of campaign we were conducting from one month to the next, how could we usefully learn and adapt? The 6-month tour also encouraged short-termism. The short-term outlook, we didn't adequately consider the needs of the campaign as a whole, rather than the impact we can make in a 6-month tour. It's natural that ambitious officers seek positive results which can be personally ascribed to them. Few of us in the army are sufficiently altruistic to set up our successors for success at the cost of our own careers. So, for example, when explaining to a brigade commander that if we help the Iraqis implement a coherent strategy for border control with Iran, we could achieve effective control after about 9 months. His comment was, "That's no good, we'll be back in England by then." As a result, nothing effective was done, and the border with Iran remained open for the rest of the conflict. With a short-term outlook, we didn't adequately consider long-term infrastructure requirements, apart from possibly the area force protection. So, for example, there was no intelligence database, extraordinary this, no intelligence database on Operation Tadic, the British operation in Iraq, akin to Project Crucible in Northern Ireland, that all battalions could access and input data into. So when, for example, a friend of mine, the intelligence officer of the 1st Battalion of the Lancashire Regiment, took over from his predecessor in Basra, he was handed a disk with 320 Word documents and 83 PowerPoint presentations as his handover. Handing over information in this form, however much information is in there, is nearly useless since it's entirely unsearchable. Similarly, when we started working with the Marsh Arabs in the border area to try and help stem the tide of Iranian weapons and influence, we need to understand the human terrain. I know many British operations were conducted in this border area from 2003 to 2005, but all the information gathered at that time was lost. We had to start from scratch trying to gather demographic and other data. This lack of build-up of knowledge and understanding in Iraq was caused by short-termism and lack of continuity. Without adequate understanding of the theatre, our friends and our enemies, we never really had much hope of successful adaptation in combat. And continuity and a long-term outlook are paradoxically critical for successful short-term adaptation. So, why was our memory so short? We talked a little bit about this yesterday. It's largely because of the limitations of personal experience. The average age of an infantry battalion commander in Iraq or Afghanistan was 38. Might be the same in your army, I don't know. This means that a commanding officer deploying to Iraq in 2008 was 24 when PYRA declared their ceasefire. So even if he had served in Northern Ireland during the conflict at all, he would have been as a platoon commander at the tail end of the conflict, and Charlie was actually one of them who did. And of course, the company commanders, who I believe are the critical level of command in counterinsurgency, won't have served in Northern Ireland at all. So personal experience of battalion commanders would have served them little in Iraq. If they had ever been in Northern Ireland, the security framework would already been in place, the police force trained and in control, our adversaries thoroughly penetrated by our HUMINT. All the systems were in place. At very junior level, it could be taken for granted, with very little understanding of why things were the way they were, or why they were set up. For example, we'd forgotten the purpose of satellite patrolling. In 2000-2003, I was sent to Quantico to try and help teach the US Marine Corps as part of their preparation for the Iraq invasion. I was asked to go and teach them how to do satellite patrolling as a mechanism for conducting urban operations in Baghdad. Now, satellite patrolling was designed in Belfast and Londonderry in direct response to PYRA's urban tactics. Their approach from the mid-1970s onwards was to avoid being killed or captured. Every volunteer, as they called them, every insurgent or terrorist, had been well trained and was precious to their organization. So there's no need to mount a risky attack today when you can wait until tomorrow and attack with less risk. So PYRA's modus operandi, as we called their doctrine at the time, was built around a secure escape route from the firing point of whatever attack they were mounting through a backyard into a waiting car in the street behind and then away to a safe house. Now, the Army developed satellite patrolling in direct response to the PYRA's tactics, splitting patrols into numerous four-man teams, or maybe six, or bricks, perhaps 6 in total, mostly on foot, but with 2 teams mounted in vehicles and perhaps a helicopter overhead. The idea being that satelliting teams operating in a random, unpredictable manner, so a PYRA attack team with all their scouts were never quite sure where they all were and whether the escape route was actually secure. If there's any doubt, they would have aborted their attack. All this was second nature to soldiers of Belfast and Derry in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. But we were still doing it in the mid-90s after the original rationale had faded, and somehow it became part of the Army's tactical lexicon, a habit, like fighting patrols, which we learned to do in Burma and still do today. And it was assumed to be the way to conduct operations. Now, I'm not saying it can't be a useful tactic, but the IRA's concern over escape routes and the urban geography of Belfast, both of which led to satellite patrolling techniques, are simply not reproducible when confronting Islamist terrorists or Islamist insurgents and suicide bombers in Baghdad. Even weaker when looking at operational and strategic levels. And the last time the British Army had anything operational experience at the operational level was the establishment of a surveillance network around Crossmaglen in 86, 87. And unless you're part of that endeavour at the time, there were very few opportunities for even quite senior Army officers ever to be involved in the operational level thinking in the campaign. I I'm going to skip through the next bit. And just talk about, sorry, I'm just skipping through this. So the Army didn't learn, another reason why the Army didn't learn appropriate lessons from Northern Ireland to Iraq is because we were too young. There are a number of senior officers in Basra, like Robin Brims, who had a deep background in Northern Ireland and were old enough to have served there in the 70s and 80s, but none after him had commanded battalions there. But there was one body of officers, of course, who did have that experience, and by the mid-2000s they were in charge of the Army and in the Chiefs of Staff Committee. And whereas the lack of experience of the younger officers is understandable, our most senior officers should have had a far greater understanding of what was needed and made sure it happened. It's bewildering to me, for example, that it took until 2009 before the MOD took seriously the issue of continuity and the need for commanders and staff to serve longer than 6-month tours in Afghanistan. This Damascene conversion, of course, came too late for the Iraq campaign, and I believe the Army was seriously let down by its most senior leadership. I'll end very briefly with the most important difference between Northern Ireland and Iraq. Main reason why one was successful, the other not. The single greatest factor why adaptation worked well in one conflict but not in the other. Northern Ireland, clear political support and priority given to maintaining the integrity of the United Kingdom. In Iraq, there was no such sustained political support following the 2003 invasion. And this, I believe, is the true cause behind the lack of consistency of approach, the constant rebranding of the type of conflict we're engaged in. If the Iraq, it's extraordinary logic this, but it is absolutely true. If the government was not prepared to provide sufficient resources for us to wage a counterinsurgency campaign, then by definition, we were obviously engaged in something else. Hence the pirouetting on pinheads to convince ourselves and others that we were actually dealing with criminality. In such circumstances, it proved impossible to generate any real confidence that we had a winning strategy. Instead, most British officers involved in the Iraq campaign knew that our approach was to limit our liability and do just enough to keep the Americans happy. Beyond introducing ever more stringent force protection measures to limit the number of politically embarrassing casualties, there was therefore little interest in doing things better in Iraq. Just enough was good enough. In Northern Ireland, of course, it was very different. We were there to win. To do so, we had to defeat our enemy, and that required constant and consistent adaptation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.